Hello and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about subzones and membership rules on the Expressway. Now, to understand subzones, you have to understand the logical architecture that is programmed into the Expressway servers. And the first logical component that you need to understand is the local zone. Now, the way you should think about it, the local zone is your expressway and the expressway is your local zone. They are one and the same, okay? And it's the local zone that's then broken up into smaller logical components. All right, so one of those components is the default subzone. Now, very important, do not confuse subzones with zones. They're not the same things, and each serve a separate and unique purpose within the local zone. So the first thing you have is a default subzone, and this is where all endpoints will register by default. And it doesn't matter if it's a SIP endpoint or if an H323 endpoint is registering, all endpoints will register automatically to the default subzones. Okay? And then we have what's called the default zone. Now notice it's not a subzone, it's a zone, because zones connect the local zone with other parts of the network. So the default zone is a default component that gives you a logical connection by default into and out of the local zone. And that's why it's out here on the edge like this, because its purpose is to connect you into or out of the local zone. Then we have another subzone called the Traversal Sub-Zone. Now, the difference between a Traversal Sub-Zone and the default subzone, first of all, is that no endpoints will ever register to the Traversal Sub-Zone. It's impossible, they can't do it. The purpose of the Traversal Sub-Zone is to handle all of your different types of traversal calls. And there are 4 different types of traversal calls that are possible on an expressway. So the first is a firewall traversal, okay, and then second you can also do an H323 to SIP traversal or vice versa. They can go in either direction. And you can do an IPv4 or IPv6 traversal. And remember, 2 and 3 are considered interworking, which we talked about already in a previous video. And then we have something called a dual NIC. And dual NIC, a dual network interface, is only available on the Expressway Edge or the VCS Expressway. It's not available on the Expressway Core or VCS Core. But when you enable dual NIC, it's so that the calls can traverse through the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. Now, we're not going to get into that, not in this lesson, but just understand that these are the 4 different types of traversal calls that you can have. So for all these call types, that's what you have the Traversal Sub-Zone for. It handles all these different types of calls. If it's not a traversal call, it doesn't go through the Traversal Sub-Zone. Now, we also have what's called default links, and links are logical connections between subzones or between a subzone and a zone. And you have 3 default links automatically on any expressway out of the box. You have a link from the default subzone to the default zone, from the default subzone to the traversal subzone, and from the traversal subzone to the default zone. Now, without a link, you have no logical connection, and therefore calls cannot connect. So, for example, in this diagram I have here, I have a SIP endpoint and an H323 endpoint that are both registered to the same subzone, but because they're registered with different protocols, that call must be routed through a traversal subzone. So without any links present, if you were to try to make a call between these 2 endpoints, that call would fail because there's no logical path through the traversal subzone. So we have to add some links in here. So let's say we add a link from the default subzone to the default zone, and then let's add a link from the default zone to the traversal subzone. Now, if we were to try to call between the SIP endpoint and the H323 endpoint, they could technically call each other because there is a logical connection from the default subzone to the traversal subzone. So technically it would work, but actually it's not the best way to do it. It's not ideal because you don't want to have to go through the default zone for an internal call. So really, the more ideal situation is to create a link between the default subzone and the traversal subzone. And that way this call would follow the shortest path. And that's part of the logic that's built into the Expressway servers, and that is that calls will always follow the shortest path. And the reason that's important is because once the shortest path is established, it will not look for an alternate route. There's no rerouting between subzones. So for example, if I were to somehow block this path between the default subzone and the traversal subzone, so the link is there, but I've blocked it. Then if I tried to call between these two endpoints, it would not work because that shortest path has been blocked. Even though there is still a logical connection, even though we still have that longer alternate route, calls won't be able to connect because the shortest path has already been established. And again, there's no rerouting on the expressway. Okay, so now you might be wondering, well, how and when and why would you want to block a path on a link? And the way you do that is with something called a pipe. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later, but just briefly, the reason you would want to put pipes on links is so that you can control the bandwidth rates that are allowed across your expressway. And actually, this is a little bit of a side note, but it's worth mentioning here that there are two different ways actually that you can control bandwidth on the expressway. One is with pipes, as I just mentioned, and the other is by creating additional subzones. So with pipes and subzones, you can create routing behavior based on bandwidth restrictions. This is similar to regions and locations on the CUCM, if you're familiar with that. Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. Let's talk about creating additional subzones. Okay, so this is what you see. This is what you have on an expressway by default. You have a local zone, a default subzone, a traversal subzone, and a default zone. And of course, you have your default links. Okay, so for example, I could create subzone 1 and subzone 2. Now, anytime I create a subzone, I'll get two links created for me automatically. I get a link from my new subzone to the default subzone, and I get a link from my new subzone to the traversal subzone. And again, that's true for any new subzone that I create. It's going to be true for subzone 1 and subzone 2. Now from here I can delete links, including the default links, and I can build additional links if I want. So for example, if I wanted to add a link in between these two newly created subzones, I could create that link for myself. But of course I'd have to do that manually. It's not created for me automatically. So now the question is, how do I get my endpoints over here to register to one of my new subzones? Because remember, by default, they're going to register to the default subzone. So if you recall from a previous video when we talked about authentication, we briefly mentioned something called membership rules. Remember that when the expressway checks the membership rules, it's not checking if an endpoint is allowed to register, it's only checking where the endpoint is allowed to register. And I'll demonstrate this in just a minute, but you can create membership rules using a subnet, or you can use an alias pattern match, similar to what we did before with authentication. So for example, I could configure subzone 1 to match any endpoint with 192.168.1.0/24, for example. And then I could configure subzone 2 to match a suffix, for example, cisco.com. And again, if you have an endpoint that doesn't match any of these rules, it's just going to register to the default subzone. That's where an endpoint will register by default. Okay? Again, this is one way to group devices based on call behaviors or abilities, or to control routing behavior or bandwidth and so forth. Okay, so let's go ahead and see how we can configure this on our expressway. So we're going to create additional subzones. So remember, based on the diagram we just went over, subzones live in the local zone. So if I go to the configuration menu and then come down to local zone, this is where I can find all of my subzones. It's just a logical way of navigating the menus. Subzones live in the local zones. So of course I'm going to go to the local zone menu item to find my default subzone, traversal subzone, and then the additional subzones that you might create. And I can go real quick under the default subzone and show you down here at the bottom. I have one registration. And it's in the default subzone. I have 4001 registered via SIP, again, where all endpoints register by default. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a new subzone. So we'll go up to Configuration, Local Zone, and Subzone. And notice at this point that I don't have any subzones created, so let's click New, and we'll call it sales_SZ. And I'd like to change the authentication policy as treat as authenticated. Now we went over these settings in the previous videos, so you should just go back and watch those if you haven't already, or if you need a refresher. And just real quick, the reason why I want to treat it as authenticated here is because I want to make sure that all of the services that are offered by the Expressway are available to this endpoint. Okay, and then notice down here that you can set up bandwidth restrictions, but we're going to just save that for another video. And then we'll just come down here and click Create Subzone. As simple as that. Okay, so now I've got a new subzone created, but notice that my endpoint isn't registering to it. And this is because I haven't created any membership rules. So to do that, what I can do is just click on the hyperlink here, or I could also go up to Configuration, Local Zone, and then Subzone Membership Rules. Either way, it'll take you to the same place. Okay, and then notice there are no rules, so I'll create one by clicking New. Okay, so let's give this a rule name. We'll say sales_MR for membership rules. And you can give it a description if you want, but I think I'll just leave it blank here. And then this has a priorities, and priorities are from 1 to 65,534, 1 being the highest priority. Now the default is 100, and it really only matters if you have multiple rules matching different aliases within your environment. In that case, then priority is going to matter. It's going to make a difference. But as long as your rules are unique enough that no alias is going to match more than one pattern, then you shouldn't have to worry about this too much. So I'm just going to leave it at 100 for now. Now, if you look at the options under type, you can see that you can create a rule based on the subnet or on alias pattern match. And just a side note, you can choose either one you want, but once you select it and then click Create Rule, there's no going back. You won't be able to change the type anytime later. Okay, so if for any reason you do need to change it, what you'll have to do is just go ahead and delete it and then create a new one from scratch. Okay, so let's talk about subnet first. So what you can do, you can go ahead and put in an IP address. So let's just say 192.168.1.0. And then here, your prefix length. This is your cyber mask. So you can put any number between 1 and 32 that you want for an IPv4 address. And then what you'll see underneath that, the address range, this is the range of IP addresses that this address with this mask falls within. So because I said 32 here, it's using 32 bits, so it's anything within this range, which in this case is just one IP address between 0 and 0. But if I change that to 24, the range is going to change here. This last octet is going to go from 0 to 255. Now, what's interesting about this little tool here is that you don't have to know the exact subnet address that you want to use because, for example, I could say 100 here. And because it's a /24, 100 falls within the range of 0 and 255. It does the math for you. So what you can do is sort of play with this, change your prefix length to come up with a customized range to pinpoint the exact addresses that you want to target. So for example, let's change this to 26, and then we can see that 100 from this last octet up here, 100 falls between 64 and 127. So now we have a tighter range of IP addresses that you can use. What if I change this to 28? Now 100 falls between 96 and 111, so the range is even tighter. So again, this is just one way for you to really pinpoint a range of IP addresses that you would want to target. Okay, so now let's look at alias pattern match, and with alias pattern match we can use exact, prefix, suffix, and regular expression. Okay, so for this we'll go ahead and choose prefix, and then under the pattern string we'll just go ahead and say 4001 because remember this is what my endpoint is currently registered as. And then here we can see that the target subzone is already set to sales subzone. So just note here that you'd have to change this if you had created additional subzones, but since this is the only one that we've created, then we're all set here. Okay, so we'll go ahead and click Create Rule. And then our membership rule has been created. So if everything worked, my endpoint at 4001, which remember was previously registered to the default subzone, should now be registered to the new sales subzone that we just created. And we can verify if that's what actually happened by going back to Configuration, and then Local Zone, and then Subzone. And then here we can see our sales subzone with one endpoint registered. Now if I click on the subzone link here, then scroll down to the bottom of the page and click View Registration Details, I can see that 4001 is in fact registered to this new sales subzone. Okay, that about does it for subzones and membership rules. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. Otherwise, that's it for now. I'll see you guys in the next one.